Hi, this is Melanie from Artifact and Landmark. Today's topic is about Alexander King and his glassworks King & Co., which operated at the corner of Breed and Denman Streets, now 12th Street, on the south side of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from about 1862 to 1869. The location of this glassworks was Alex King's old soda ash factory. Like many of the glassworks of the day, it operated under a trade name, this one being the Jenny Lind Glassworks. So Jenny Lind was a famous Swedish opera singer who was born in 1820, around the same time as King. She was world-renowned and toured the U.S. from 1850 to 1852, causing what was coined as Lind Mania. You can find many antique collectibles related to Jenny Lind. We believe that this may be the reason he also chose to call his daughter Jenny. Alexander King is mostly known today for Baywood, a mansion in the Second Empire Victorian style. The home is located in the Highland Park neighborhood of Pittsburgh. The neighborhood would have been known as Collins Township when King moved to the area in the 1850s. King is also known for his connection to the Mellon family through his daughter Jenny's marriage to Richard Beatty Mellon. Richard was the president of Mellon Bank and for a time Alcoa. A less known connection to the Mellon family is King's friendship with the Negley family, who were also relatives of the Mellon family. Although he did own a glass factory, King's largest impact on the glass industry was as a supplier and investor. He was a successful merchant, and his fortune, like many of the day, was also greatly due to his vast real estate holdings, which became his focus in the last 20 years of his life. Alexander Hayes King was born in about 1818, although that date is also reported as 1816. He was born in Milford in the county of Donegal, Ireland, and was for a time studying to enter the clergy. This initial path in his life provided a better education than most would have received in the day, and he was said to have been very well read. In the mid to late 1830s, at the age of about 17, he decides to take a non-secular path in life and moves to Baltimore, Maryland, where his family lived. He would have worked for about 3 years for a wholesale grocer, which may have also been a firm owned by his family. He then follows his brother Robert Hayes King to Pittsburgh. Alexander would have worked for Robert's wholesale grocery business for several years. Now, we're not exactly sure when he left, but we do know that by the age of about 25 in 1843, he is in a partnership with John Watt. They operate their wholesale grocery business as Watt and King. The location is on Liberty Street, opposite Hand Street in Pittsburgh, which is now 9th Street. You can see in these advertisements from 1844 that they were selling a wide variety of goods, including coffee, tea, tobacco, fish, oils, and groceries. In 1844, we see John Watt leave the firm and Alexander King carry on the business. In 1845, Pittsburgh experiences a fire which becomes known as the Great Conflagration. Although his offices and warehouse escape any damage, his customers aren't so lucky. A good portion of Pittsburgh was destroyed by the fire, including many of the glassworks. Bakewell was one of these unlucky businesses, and you can see the destruction in this painting from 1845 by William C. Wall, a local painter. Now, King sees an opportunity in the mid-1840s. Pittsburgh glassworks were mainly using potash, which is wood ash. Articles report that King had relatives in Liverpool, England, which was a center of soda ash production in the 1840s. English glassworks had already switched to soda ash, and King wanted to take advantage of this innovation and supply the Pittsburgh market. First, of course, he needed to convince Pittsburgh glass manufacturers to use it. In this article from 1890, a story is recounted of how Alex King convinced William McCully & Co. to switch from potash to soda ash. William McCully & Co., who then owned the largest factory in the United States, refused to use soda ash. They were afraid of spoiling their mix. Finally, Mr. King induced him to try a few casks, and Mr. McCully said it had a demoralizing effect on his men. They all got intoxicated and ruined the glass. However, the use of soda ash was kept up, and today thousands of tons are consumed annually. We also see some inclination of William McCully using soda ash. We see a newspaper article from 1847, which are the imports by river, and we see casks of soda ash arriving on the steamboat Messenger, destined for William Macaulay's works. As a side note, this is the same boat that Charles Dickens writes about in his book American Note. Charles Dickens ordered the boat to travel from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati, which would have taken 3 days during his visit in 1842. He described the steamboat as crowded and concludes that one feels directly that the wonder is not that there should be so many fatal accidents, but that any journey should be safely made. Over the next 5 years, we see King continue his wholesale grocery trade, and like his brother, he also starts to buy up real estate. In 1849, we see him buy property on 5th Street, now 5th Avenue, at Cherry Alley, now called Cherry Way, for $1,330, and we can see the location of that property on this map from 1852. This will be the location of his home, but he will soon move. In an ad from 1857, his home at Cherry and 5th is described as having 11 rooms, a wash house, a brick stable, and a carriage house. It highlights its creature comforts, including hot and cold water, with a bath, and it's supplied with gas. He also buys property in Allegheny City, now known as North Side Pittsburgh, for $2,570. Around 1850, he marries Eliza Jane Smith, who is the daughter of John W. Smith, a wholesale grocer in Cincinnati, Ohio. Alex would be about 32 years old, and Eliza would be about 18 years old. In 1853, Alexander King partners with Thomas Graham, forming a company called King and Graham. The purpose of this company is to manufacture soda ash. The factory would be located at Breed and Denman, now 12th Street, on the south side of Pittsburgh. In 1856, Alexander King buys property in Collins Township at an auction. The property belonged to a nephew of Sarah J. Negley Mellon, Jenny's future mother-in-law. At this time, Collins Township was considered the countryside of Pittsburgh, but today it's a borough of Pittsburgh called Highland Park. His youngest son, Robert, will recount that James Macaulay, who owned the adjoining property to Negley, had asked Alexander King to come to the property's auction since the auction needed 2 bidders. Much to Macaulay's surprise, King outbids him on the property, which became a sore point between the two. The property in Collins will be King's home until his passing and will allow him to fully enjoy his outdoorsman interests, and there would be plenty of land for his growing herd of horses and cows to graze. King's home will become known as Baywood, which gets its name from part of his property, which in the 1850s and 1860s housed a nursery called Baywood, established by General Negley and James Kennedy, and subsequently sold to Thomas Mellon Jr., Judge Thomas Mellon's son. The next year, in 1857, King buys the assets of the glassworks of Adams, Macklin & Co. during a sheriff's sale. Purchase will be contested by other creditors in the upcoming years, and King will have to pay these creditors. We believe that King becomes an investor in John Adams' glasswork until about 1862. So also in 1857, King joins the board of the Monongahela Insurance Company. Unfortunately, the next year, King's wife passes during a trip to Philadelphia in February. She would have only been 26 years old. She is buried at the Alexander King family plot in the Allegheny Cemetery. At the end of that same year, in December of 1858, Alexander King is involved in a carriage accident while traveling through Lawrenceville, a town between Collins and Pittsburgh. It's reported that he lost control of his horse and collides with a wagon. Both Alex and his fellow passenger were thrown from the carriage. Although the passenger is not named, we do find out that he does suffer a slight contusion. Now, King fared worse with a badly bruised face and a broken hand. In 1859, we see King seemingly transition away from wholesale groceries to being much more focused on supplying the glass industry. Advertisements include glass manufacturing chemicals and German clay, which was the preferred clay used to make the clay pots needed to melt the glass mix. In 1860, Alexander King puts up his soda ash factory for rent, but it's reported that his venture into soda ash manufacturing was never a success. With the 1860 census, Alex would now be about 41 years old. We see that his fortunes have grown and that he's remarried. He now reportedly owns $50,000 in real estate across the boroughs of Pittsburgh, Allegheny, Birmingham, and Collins Township. He also has an additional $50,000 in personal assets. The total value of his estate in 1860 would have been about $4 million in today's money. So his second wife, which he marries around 1860, is Sarah Cordelia Smith. She's a sister of his first wife, Eliza Jane Smith. There's a book that gets published, and so we get a glimpse within this of what the two sisters looked like. When Alexander King of the East End brought his first wife to Pittsburgh from Cincinnati as a bride, she was a beauty of the Langtree type, fair and fresh as Aurora, sweet and blushing as Hebe, with beautiful light brown hair with golden tints, and a sweet, kindly disposition which reached all hearts and won the respect and love of all neighbors. She died early, and sometime after her death, Mr. King married her sister, the present Mrs. King, who is also a noted beauty in her youth's young day, and who even now is counted one of the prettiest women in Pittsburgh. Of the blonde type, with beautiful hair and eyes and complexion, with the most genial manners, bright conversational ability, and brilliant social powers, Mrs. King is admired by all who know her. Her young daughter, just blooming into womanhood, bids fair to equal the reputation of her mother's beauty and grace. 2 years after their marriage, in 1862, Alexander and Sarah welcomed their first son, Alexander. Also that year, in 1862, we see Alexander King separate from the glassworks of Adams & Co., forming his own glassworks of King & Co. The location of this glass factory, not surprisingly, is at his old soda ash factory at 12th and Breed Streets on the South Side of Pittsburgh. He also continues to operate his wholesale business. King was known to have a wide variety of interests, and he kept company with businessmen and sportsmen alike. We get an interesting example of this in 1862, when a champion rower by the name of James Hamill names his boat after Alexander King as a token of his appreciation. This boat would be part of many rowing competitions across the U.S. in the years to come. The next year, in 1863, the family welcomes their second son, William Smith King. In 1864, manufacturers, including King, become concerned over the price of coal and aim to create a buying cooperative to control prices. In 1865, the court finds that King's purchase in 1857 of Adams, Macklin & Co.'s assets during the sheriff's sale was unfair to the other creditors of the glassworks. He, along with Michael McCullough, another wholesale grocer, are ordered to pay $16,200. In 1866, we see King move to his new warehouse and offices at 121st Street. The property would extend through to 94 Water Street, and we'll see him using both addresses. He also starts on improvements to his glassworks located on the south side. Unfortunately, during the improvements to the glassworks, there's a tragic accident. A scaffolding that was being used by several workers collapses. One man, George Kent, is propelled into the air and falls, unfortunately, down into the construction debris. It's said that he died instantly. 2 other men who were on the scaffold were injured and brought to local homes where doctors tended to them. They recovered. The following year, in 1867, we see an advertisement for the glassworks, which indicates that King & Co. is focused on producing glassware, lamps, lamp chimneys, green and clear fruit jars. Here in 1867, King sees a few happy events. The first is the arrival of King's only daughter, Jenny T. King, who will marry Richard B. Mellon. That year, King also celebrates his trotting horse Champagne, who wins in the speed category at the annual exhibition of the Pennsylvania State Agricultural Society. 2 of King's other horses also place. His horses become a true passion, and they will continue to place at many of these exhibitions and will also race, winning several purses. In 1868, King sells some property to a new glassworks called Doyle & Co., which we covered in another video. You can see the original Greg plan with lots 214 to 219 and a corresponding map from 1872 that shows the location of the Doyle & Co. glassworks. You'll also see that right next door to the Doyle factory is Adams & Co., which is run by John Adams, the old partners to both Alexander King and the Doyle brothers. That same year, many townships, including Kingstown of Collins, gets annexed into Pittsburgh. These townships also included Lawrenceville, Liberty, Oakland, Peoples, and Pitt. In 1869, King, along with many business leaders on the South Side of Pittsburgh, organized a new traction company called the Pittsburgh and Ormsby Borough Passenger Railway. This will serve the South Side and cross into Pittsburgh by way of the 10th Street Bridge. That year, also in 1869, King rents out his glassworks to Ralph and James Johnson, who had just dissolved their partnership with King, Son & Co., an unrelated glassworks, which we've also covered in another video. Ralph and James Johnson rent King's glass factory to start their own glassworks under the style of Johnson & Co., which dissolves a few years later. Next, another glassworks, James Lindsay & Co., rents the factory, relocating several years later. By 1880, the location is idle, and by 1884, a Sanborn map lists it as old and dilapidated. So by 1872, King seems mostly concerned about his real estate investments and the state of city affairs. The U.S. will also enter what is known as the Long Depression, an economic recession that lasts from about 1873 to about 1879. That year, in 1872, more boroughs are annexed into Pittsburgh. These are west of the Monongahela River and include Birmingham, Temperatesville, St. Clair, Allentown, Union, Mount Washington, Monongahela, Ormsby, South Pittsburgh, and West Pittsburgh. That year, Pittsburgh also passes the Equalization Ordinance. The result for King and many Pittsburgh real estate owners is they had their real estate reassessed. King continually seems to be fighting the city in terms of the reassessment, and he believes the new tax scheme was actually driving down the value of his properties. He also loses trust in the city's leadership, joining the Committee of 40, a group of 40 businessmen who want to investigate what they view as mismanagement and corruption of city officials. He, along with Judge Thomas Mellon, represent the taxpayer union as the city books are audited. Judge Mellon was also a large landowner, had recently retired from the bench, and was busy establishing many companies, including Mellon Bank. We can see that King was serious about uncovering fraud. In one article, we see King sending taxpayer union representatives to measure the amount of tile used in a city project, finding a discrepancy between what was charged for versus what was used. Amid all this, Pennsylvania ratified its constitution, which comes into effect in 1874. That same year, the King family also welcomes their youngest son, Robert Burns King. It's speculated that this son was named after the Scottish poet Robert Burns, who today is probably best known for his poem Auld Lang Syne, a New Year's favorite. In 1875, the city auditors returned the report and find the city books are in order, but the decisions made about contracts may not have been in the best interest of the city. In 1876, he and other citizens attempt to block the city from issuing more municipal bonds or to get into more debt. He also continues to fight for reductions in his property's assessments. In 1877, King sees a victory when he fights a city assessment for road work. He wins on the grounds that the city never issued an ordinance. In 1878, King is now about 60 and his eldest son is 16 years old. We see his son taking on his father's country interests when he enters a shooting competition. On May 18th, Alexander Jr. wins the shooting competition by shooting 28 out of the 30 targets, which were glass balls. The balls would have been launched up about 50 feet. The next year, we see a major tragedy in King's life. At 11 o'clock at night on April 23, 1879, a fire starts in the King's stables. The fire spreads to King's home. Luckily, the family was able to escape the building, but the house and stables burned down. Unfortunately, only one horse survives the fire, and only because it happened to be out in the pasture. His other 9 horses and 6 cows perish in the fire. It seems almost everything in the home and the stables were destroyed. In later years, his son Robert recalls sitting under a chestnut tree in his pajamas and watching the house burn. He would have been about 5 years old. King believed the fire was arson. He recounts hearing the dogs bark the night before, and this night he was reading in his library when he heard his dogs barking again around 10 p.m. He and his sons went out to check the stables and the grounds. He didn't find anything, so he went back into his house. He then remembers seeing the barn on fire from a window in his home at 11:30 p.m. King had owned the property for quite a while and had decided to stop carrying an insurance policy on the house. We know that there was some delay in notifying the fire department. And when they arrived at the vast property, they found that their hose was too short to reach the fire. The loss was reported at $40,500. King, his wife, and 4 children temporarily moved in with his brother Robert H. King, who is now president of the Cash Insurance Company and living at 61 Liberty Street, now Lockhart Street, on the north side of Pittsburgh. They then rent Samuel McElroy's property on Highland while King rebuilds. They move into their new home on Thanksgiving, 1880. In 1882, Alexander King joins the board of the Cash Insurance Company, the same company where his brother Robert is president. In 1883, King gets into another driving accident. He is again thrown from the carriage. In 1883, he moves from his location on Water and Firth Streets back to his old address at 136 Fifth Avenue, which he had sold to Nelson P. Reed in 1875. He also no longer lists himself as being part of the glass and chemicals industry, but is now focused uniquely on real estate. In 1886, we see Alexander King continuing to manage his real estate, posting advertisements, and we even see him attempting to rent his old glass factory. We also see his son Alexander join the firm. He's about 24 years old. In 1887, one article gives us the impression that King is slowing down. He's leaving much of the driving of his carriage up to his son. But in 1889, King is in another accident and is thrown again from his buggy. This time it's said that his recovery is slower than expected. On September 15, 1890, Alexander King passes from a blood clot. He's 72 years old. He leaves behind his wife Sarah, sons Alexander, William, and Robert, along with his daughter Jenny T. King. His older brother, Robert H. King, also survives him. After Alexander's death, the old glassworks gets subdivided and eventually will become a railroad overpass, passing over the Pittsburgh, Virginia, and Charleston Railroad, now part of the Pennsylvania Railroad. His wife, Sarah Cordelia Smith King, passes on May 5, 1911, of unfortunately cancer. She is buried in the Allegheny Cemetery alongside her husband, Alexander King, and her sister. Next, we'll briefly cover what happens to the King's 3 sons, his only daughter, and Baywood. But first, we wanted to mention one more tie to the Negleys. Now, we mentioned that King expanded his property, that Baywood is owned by Catherine Negley. King will eventually buy the one portion of land that was called Baywood. We can see here his ownership expanding and absorbing that property. So Catherine, known also as Kitty Negley, Kitty was a longtime neighbor of Alexander King. She was the aunt of General James S. Negley, who previously owned King's home, and she's also the sister of Sarah J. Negley Mellon, Jenny King's future mother-in-law. So it seems that King was paying the taxes on some of Catherine's properties. Although he passes before her in 1890, she left several properties to King in her will. And I'll read the excerpt from her will so you'll understand a little bit why she did this. Now, this would have been the first item in her will. First, in consideration of the fact that Mr. Alexander King has always paid the taxes on the piece of ground which lies between his property and John H. McKelvey's property, bounded on the north by Alexander King, I give and devise the said piece of ground to said Alexander King, his heirs and assigns. I also give and assign to said Alexander King and his heirs and assigns a strip of ground in the same ward lying between his land and Negley Avenue, so that Mr. King's land may extend to and front on Negley Avenue. These devises to Mr. King I make to show my appreciation of his long friendship for me and his constant efforts and aid to make me comfortable and save my property from sacrifice. Now on to Alexander's heirs. His eldest son, Alexander Jr., was born April 16, 1862. He marries Mary Hovler on June 8, 1892. They have 5 children: Alexander, Mary Gladys, Adelaide, Sarah, and William. Unfortunately, King's wife Mary passes on December 16, 1900 at the young age of 33 from childbirth. Alexander Jr. and his family will continue to live at his wife Mary's family home located at 506 Highland Avenue, but eventually the family moves to 5920 Wellesley Avenue. Alexander Jr. passes on February 9, 1930 and is buried at the Allegheny Cemetery. King's second son, William, is born November 14th, 1863. William marries Winona Winter West on his birthday, November 14th, 1901. He's 38, she's 32 years old. Winona is a widow and brings 2 children into the marriage. Jeanette, aged about 10 at the time, and Donald, aged about 9 at the time. Unfortunately, William passes quite suddenly on May 5th, 1904, while getting an operation due to peritonitis. He's only 41 years old. He leaves most of his fortune to his wife Winona. She does remarry in 1908 to Dr. Fred B. McMillan, a dentist, but it's interesting to note that the census records from 2 years later in 1910 shows her 2 children listed as bearing the name of King instead of West, their biological father. It isn't until February 1917 that Donald West officially changes his name to Donald West King. This would be a few months before he joins the forces to fight in World War I. Donald leaves Princeton University in May of that year to join the war effort and will fight on the front lines and be part of the Lost Battalion of World War I. Although he's rescued from a shell hole, he would soon die of pneumonia on November 3rd, 1918. So Alexander's only daughter, Jenny T. King, was born on June 14, 1867. She attends Pennsylvania Female College in Shadyside, now Chatham University, as part of the class of 1887. This is a picture of the student body from that year. We also have a picture of the Latin class from 1887, and we believe that Jenny is over here on the left-hand side, but we could not confirm this. The location of the school would have been about 2.5 miles from the King Estate. You can see the location of the school and the King Estate on this map. Today, Chatham has a library named after Jenny. Jenny marries Richard Beatty Mellon on November 16, 1897. Her husband, Richard, is also known as Dick. He's born on March 19, 1858. And so he would have been 39 years old when he married, and she would have been 30. They would first make their home at the King Estate, and their son, Richard King Mellon, would be born there in 1899. Richard Beatty Mellon is the son of Judge Thomas Mellon, who established Mellon Bank. He was the younger brother of Andrew Mellon and would become a partner of Mellon Bank after the death of his younger brother, George. Jenny and Richard become involved in many philanthropic projects, which include the Carnegie Institute. We have a picture here from 1927 on Founders Day, and you can see Jenny King and the 2 Mellon brothers, Richard and Andrew, and center is Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States. Another project was the Mellon Institute of Industrial Research, which was established in 1913 in memory of Judge Thomas Mellon. At first, it was part of Pittsburgh University and merges with the Carnegie Institute of Technology in 1967, and the university then becomes known as Carnegie Mellon University. Richard and Jenny also fund a new church building for the East Liberty Presbyterian Church at Highland and Penn Avenues, and this would be as a memorial to their mothers, Sarah Jane Negley Mellon and Sarah Cordelia Smith King. Jenny and Richard have 2 children, Richard King Mellon and Sarah Cordelia Mellon Scaife. The children grew up in the mansion at 6500 Fifth Avenue and had the Frew family as their neighbors. Today, the property is part of Mellon Park. You can see pictures of the home here from 1927. Richard passes in 1933, and Jenny passes 5 years later in 1938. Their son, Richard King Mellon, will become president of Mellon Bank, and in 1947, he founds the Richard King Mellon Foundation. In 1967, he donates over $2 million to his mother's alma mater, Chatham University. Their daughter, Sarah Cordelia Mellon Scaife, establishes her foundation in 1941. The Scaife home will also become part of Mellon Park. So it's fitting to end this video with the youngest son of Alexander and Sarah King, Robert Burns King, since he was the last king to live in the family home Baywood. Robert was born September 21, 1874, and marries Mildred A. Kelly on November 8, 1911, in a quiet ceremony since they're still mourning the loss of their matriarch, Sarah King, who had died about 5 months before. Mildred would have been 34 years old, born on February 15, 1877. Her parents would live with the couple, and Robert would be in the real estate business. The union does not produce children, and Mildred passes in 1949. Robert passes 5 years later on October 15th, 1954, at the age of 80. He's the only child buried with his father and mother in Alexander King's family plot at the Allegheny Cemetery. Now, the family home was donated by Robert 5 years before his death. This donation came about due to the city wanting to build an amphitheater on part of the King and some adjoining residents' properties. Part of King's agreement with the city was that by accepting the donation of Baywood, they would discontinue their plans to build an open-air theater on the family property and have the property annexed into Highland Park. The agreement also stipulated that he would be able to live out his final years in his home undisturbed. King's vision was that Baywood would become a nature reserve. After his death, the property was annexed into Highland Park. In 1955, it first served as the home for a new nonprofit called the Pittsburgh Plan for Art, which exhibited artists' work and had a lending scheme whereby people could take the artwork home and was meant to help promote artists. In 1979, it became a site of Pittsburgh's arts in the park and environmental programs. At one point, it becomes known as the King Environmental Learning Center. By 1990, the location was providing adult and children art and music programs, and essentially only the first floor was being used. Unfortunately, also that year, the city found that it could not afford to maintain the structure or bring it up to code, so they put out a solicitation with the aim to have a non-profit restore and then use the building. Instead, a couple stepped forward looking to buy the property and to restore it, returning it to its previous use as a private residence. It would take 4 years for the city to take the necessary steps to sell the property. After a public solicitation for offers, the property is sold to that original couple who continued to show their interest in buying the property. The estimates to rehabilitate the property was between 1 to 1.8 million. So the city sells the property for $150,000, and it has since been restored. In 2020, after 25 years of owning the property was put on the market. It has been on and off the market for the past 5 years and hasn't been sold. That the real estate platforms that are out there has a lot of great pictures of this property. There's also a dedicated website that includes some old pictures of the property and the King family. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed learning more about Alexander King, his impact on the glass industry, Baywood, and the family's legacy. Subscribe to learn more about the history about the glass industry, Pittsburgh, and regional landmarks.